All right, good morning. Welcome to our 2025 Economic Summit here. We're excited this morning. We have some great speakers, Steve Scranton from Washington Trust, and then we have a couple internal tax partners, Renee Davis from KDP and Todd Ames from Harris, to give us an update this morning. I think this is probably the 10th or 11th one we've done, but it's exciting to see some recurring faces in here and a lot of new faces as well, as we've definitely changed over the past year. Before we get going, I usually just give a quick update on Harris and what we've been doing over the past year. We've had a lot of things come together as we have continued to look at how we wanted to expand and how we wanted to grow and continue to go into the market. So in this past year, just locally here, Harris, KDP, and Chigbrow, Ryan, and Murata have all come together. We're busy working on that all over the past year and into 2025 as we continue to come together as one firm. So it's exciting. I think the ability to provide even more services, to have more people and great people as we deliver our services and work with each other is really exciting to us. So we're excited to see this, and you'll see more to come in the upcoming year. Every year we look as a firm on kind of our strategic initiatives of what we want to accomplish in the upcoming year, especially right now with what's going through in the accounting profession and how the CPA world is evolving over time. As we look into next year, we have some initiatives that we just want to share with you. The four initiatives here, becoming one firm, growth, client service, and productivity, are all things that we look at. We're starting to see our offshoring team, the implement of AI and technology and how that's transforming our industry, continue to be big or significant impact in how we do that. We want to make sure, even with the mergers and the growth, that we look at one firm and coming together. We believe in that model. We believe that helps us deliver the best services, to be able to work together. So we'll continue to look at that as well. And with that, when we're all coming together, you'll see probably mid-May or June of this year, we're going to come under a new brand. So that'll be very exciting for us as we work through that process in the upcoming year. When we look at our initiatives for growth, I think it's really important to know there's growth and companies out there that all they worry about is just growth, and that's all that matters. For us, what matters is that we're growing in the right way, that we have our culture. We're very similar and aligned with CRM and KDP and the others that we're continuing to partner with, and that we're growing under our lens. And when I say our lens, we have a mission statement that's focused on our people, our clients, and our community. And we believe all three have to be in balance for us to have growth and for us to have success. So as we look for growth, we really look for ways to do that in a smart manner. And you'll see a lot of that coming up in the upcoming year with us, but it's really important that we keep true to who we are and what we do. Each year, and before, this will be my last slide before we get to the real speakers, but each year we focus on our values. We're a value-driven firm. We have 5 core values, whether it's mutual respect, integrity, heart, united, and quality. But we do a lot of things every year for that. This upcoming year, we do, well, one way we work on our values is through what we call our thematic goal project. As a firm, an entire firm, we pick one value each year that we're going to dedicate, and a lot of teams dedicate on getting better at that value. We're not perfect by any means, but we do. This year, we picked mutual respect. We have a lot of people across our firms working on different projects to see how that value is ingrained in our client service, in our interaction with each other and with our communities, and trying to get better at mutual respect. It started last fall with our annual team building day. That team building day actually started with this thematic goal project probably 7 or 8 years ago when we started it, but we used mutual respect part of that day. And I just wanted to share one thing of that day. We invited the J Foundation to come and talk to us in the morning. The J Foundation, I don't know if anyone has heard of it, but they're out of Twin Falls. They talk a lot about mental health and suicide, and it was a very powerful speech and activities that they ran us through that morning. Just respecting, part of mutual respect for us is respecting each other and one's whole life and the importance of that. And so just a plug for me, if you haven't heard of the J Foundation, it's a local foundation out of Twin Falls. It's fantastic, and I would suggest you look at it. It was really impactful and just kind of kicked off all the other projects that we're doing over the next year dedicated around mutual respect. So with that, and you guys will see a lot more coming from from Harris and KDP and CRM in the upcoming year as we continue to expand, as we continue to come together, as we continue to do that. I hope that you guys all realize as you see things coming through, we always keep in mind that lens. How are every decision we're going to make going to positively impact our clients and our community and each other? And so I hope as you see this in 2025, we're really excited about a lot of the things we're going to do, a lot of the ways we're going to be able to partner with all three of those categories. I hope you see that come through. But this morning, we have great speakers. We have both a tax and economic update, and we're really happy to have Steve Scranton back from, I don't know how many years in a row this is, but 4. It was 4th year in a row. We dabbled with some other economic speakers before. It was our mistake. As soon as we found Steve, it's been awesome every single year. Steve is the chief economist for Washington Trust. He's been there for over 40 years, always gives us absolutely wonderful speech and a lot of information. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Steve.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everybody. We're going to do things a little differently for you this year. One, you can see we're learning to use headsets. But the other is you have on your desk or your table stand-up things with QR codes. And if you want to participate or be interactive with today, if you use your cell phone, scan the QR code. I'm going to have 2 polls during my presentation where you get to show your opinion on that. And then we're going to take the questions this year through the QR code as well, be able to see what the questions are on the screen and answer them for you. One of the nice features with that is if you see a question and you want that question answered and you vote on it, it moves it to the top. So the one with the most votes will get moved to the top. So that way, if we run out of time, we at least have hit the most important questions. So today, what I wanted to do for you is start off giving you an update on the current state of the U.S. economy, then talk about monetary policy, what's going on with interest rates, talk about risks we need to be thinking about, looking out for 2025, and then finish it up with an update on the Treasure Valley economy. And I see that I have to adapt if I'm invited back next year now that you have offices in Oregon too. I have Oregon stuff, but I didn't know you had offices now, so I will include those for next year as well. But this year, it's just going to be for Idaho. So let's start off with then, where do we stand with the economy? And for those who've heard me speak before, you know that my whole mantra is I always start with jobs, because jobs are what creates income for the consumers. Consumers use that income to spend, and consumer spending makes up 70% of economic growth right now. So let's start off with jobs. There's been talk, Chairman Powell had said back in August when he said that it's time for the Fed to start moving to change direction on interest rates. One of the things he cited was they were starting to be concerned about the labor markets. Because we had seen a weak jobs report before the meeting, but what we have seen now, what I've given you here is the average monthly addition of jobs for each year. And I went back for the last expansion, 2010 through 2019. What did we see for monthly job creation there? I threw out 2020 and 21 because of COVID and then showed you forward from there. And what we see far right for you, not the green bar, but the one just before that, the U.S. averaged 186,000 jobs per month last year. That compares to that 10-year cycle where the average for the whole cycle was 183,000. So what I tell people is we are on solid footing with jobs right now. We even were surprised with December. We added 256,000 jobs. So suddenly Fed is going, ooh, I thought we were going to have problems with jobs. It looks like jobs just slowed a little bit, and they're still solid. So that's a good sign to say the economy's on solid footing when it comes to jobs creation. When we look at personal income and personal spending. The green line is personal income, the red line is personal spending. You can see they're practically identical. But the bottom line is I always look at what we call real disposable personal income. That is your income after taxes, after inflation. That's kind of your spendable money. And then real spending is, adjusted for inflation. And what I say is, this is through November. We haven't got December yet, but personal income grew at 2.6% year over year. Personal spending grew at 2.9% year over year. Figure 70% of 2.9%, and you're talking really about 2% growth just from the consumer heading into 2025. The only comment I would make here is that long term, you can't keep spending at a faster pace than your income is growing. It's not an issue right now, but I said, if it continues, that's going to be a problem if consumers outpace, because they're going to use up their savings. And the difference with the consumer compared to the federal government is they can't deficit spend. Once they run out of their savings, they run out of their income sources, they will have to cut back. But for now, solid footing for both income and spending. And so what that brings us to is gross domestic product, which is the measure of U.S. economic growth. And what I would point out to you there, yes, we had a slight slowing in the third quarter. We haven't gotten fourth quarter yet. But the real bottom line is we've been hovering for most of the year pretty close to 3% economic growth for the year. And really since the first quarter of 2023, after we had the dip, we've averaged 2.9% growth from the first quarter of 2023 through the third quarter of 2024. That compares to that 10-year time frame, 2010 to 2019, 2.4% was the growth rate there, and everybody felt that was a very solid economy. So for all the worry that we continue to have from people, for all of the noise of politics, what I just continue to say is we got through a whole election year, all the noise there, businesses stayed focused on business, and we have an economy that's on solid footing heading into 2025. And I think that's just I always say, look, if we've got a 3% base that we're working from, we can absorb more negative shocks than if we were growing at 1%. So we still have lots of different uncertainties for this year, but I just simply say we're off, we're starting on solid footing. We'll just need to see where we go from there. So that brings us then to the question is, so where do we go with interest rates? And I think what I would highlight once again, the Fed's two mandates is full employment, stable inflation at 2%. So when I look at full employment, before we get there, I want to get your feedback. This is hopefully you've scanned your QR codes now, but I want your opinion. Where do you think 30-year mortgage rates will be at the end of 2025? Will they be between 4 to 5%, between 5 to 6%, 6 to 7%, or 8 to 9%? So I'm going to give you a minute. We'll see real time what the results are. I suggest you put your answer in first. Don't be influenced by everybody else. But we can see as we look here is that most people think right now it's going to be between 5 to 6%. And I would tell you right now, 30-year mortgage rates are at 7.125%. So there is a belief among the audience that long-term rates are going to be coming down this year. So I'll give you my feedback, but I'll go ahead and move on. Pretty even split, but really, it's just slightly more. I think we'll be at 5 to 6% compared to 6 to 7%. What I would tell you is when I'm looking at the Fed, as they're thinking about do we need to lower rates or what do we need to do, I would argue we're at full employment. Full employment is the way we define that from an economic standpoint is when the amount of job openings is about the same as the amount of unemployed people, a 1-to-1 ratio. We're currently at 1.1 to 1. I think that is about as close as you get. You'll never get every unemployed person to fill every open job because there's different skill sets, everything else. But that compares to where we were in 2022 when we had 2 job openings for every unemployed person. So businesses are at least back to neutral now. A little more bargaining power to say that you don't have all kinds of choices, you can go somewhere else. So the Fed's met their mandate there. No need to lower interest rates if you're worried about a labor market at this point in time. So that must mean then inflation is going to come down, right? Or inflation was good news, so that'll keep them lowering interest rates. Here is what I would show you for inflation. You can't read the numbers. I would also say quickly, you can get a copy of the slide deck from Harris. I've provided it to them. But the bottom line is the gray line for each of these two is where we would need to be to hit the Fed's target. I actually gave them a little leeway and said to get to 2.25% by year end. Red line is consumer price index, core, and the yellow is core PCE. Those are the two inflation indexes the Fed looks at. And I would simply say we did not come close to their goal. And yet, Chairman Powell said, well, that's okay because it's going to be coming down and we're willing to go ahead and start cutting rates. I would just simply say this was through November. We had core CPI at 3%. We got December's numbers earlier this month. We finished the year at 3.2% compared to the 2% goal. We're going to get PCE later this month, but it looks like if it's the same as a type of monthly increase, we'll be about 2.7% for that. I would simply say we are not there yet. And I think that is something why I believe and why the Fed paused in December. I think the Fed is worried that we started lowering rates because one, we thought inflation will keep coming down, and two, the labor market looked like it was weakening. Now the labor market has maintained its strength, and inflation just has proven to be sticky right around 3%. So my feedback to you, not to burst your bubble, but I think that right now the belief is from the financial markets and from the Fed themselves that they will lower rates about 0.5% for the whole year. So they're currently, the overnight borrowing rate is at 4.5%. That would get us to 4%. That means that as a business person, if you have variable rate loans tied to the short-term borrowing costs, like a line of credit or a operating line, something like that, you've already seen those rates come down a percentage point because the Fed's lowered that short-term rate by a percentage point. You might see another 0.5% from there. My biggest caution for people is I'm not going to give you encouraging news for long-term rates because what has happened is short-term rates have fallen by 1 full percentage point since September. Long-term rates have risen by almost 1.25 percentage points. And you'd say, well, what's going on? And I would say two things in my mind to explain that fairly simply is one, the long-term investor saying, I don't believe you got inflation conquered yet. And if there's going to be new policies that might be inflationary, I got to be compensated for locking my money up for 10 or 20 or 30 years. So they've added in that inflation premium more than it was before. And the other they're saying is, I'm not encouraged by what I'm hearing from even the new administration that we're going to actually start to work on reducing our deficit, that if we're talking tax cuts and things like that, that could be deficit spending again. So the long end of the market now is starting to tell Congress, you're going to pay a lot more in interest expense if you keep doing this. You need to offset your spending with revenue. And if you don't, we, the bond investor, are going to push long-term rates up saying we need to be compensated for that. We actually had a name for that back in the early 80s when we had a similar inflation problem. They were called the bond vigilantes. They were the only ones being vigilant about saying you can't deficit spend as much as you are. So this is going to be interesting to watch. But my feedback to you is one, just for one, with the communication style of President Trump, I think that the financial markets are going to be more volatile because his style is to say something, very loud and brash and then, modify as you go along. And so I think that we can see the 10-year Treasury between 3.5% to 5%. Right now, I believe when I saw it this morning, it's about 4.76. And I think that we'll see mortgage rates between 6 to 7.5%. And as he told you right now, they're at 7 1/8. For the group that's hoping for 5 to 6% mortgage rates, I'm going to say you better be patient because we have to see progress on inflation for that to happen. And so the one thing I'd point out, though, that's, the borrowers are saying, when are rates going to come down? Savers are all saying, I don't want rates coming down. For 10 years, I subsidized you borrowers by having nothing foreign earnings. It's my turn now. I should be earning something over inflation. And so they're very happy. And that's a source of income, especially for retirees where they're able to spend when they're still earning 4% with government money market mutual funds. So I think there's, two sides of the coin. Are you a borrower or a spender? But the real thing that I look at there then is saying, so you've told me the economy's on solid footing heading into 2025. You told me that interest rates sounds like they're going to be somewhat stable, not dramatically declining. So what are the risks we need to be thinking about that could affect economic growth and ultimately maybe cause rates to come down more or go up more? I will continue to say, since the consumer is the source of our strength for the economy, what's the source of stress for the consumer? Inflation, I will argue, for them, and actually the consumer says, I could care less about inflation, it's prices. Prices are up and they're not coming down. And when are they going to come down? So what I've just tried to highlight here, red bars, there's two pieces of inflation, the service industry and the goods producing industry. The red bars are all the service producing industry major categories. And you can see all of the red bars are up by more than 2.5% year over year. And some of them are up, the worst one, auto insurance, up over 11.5%. Green bars are the goods producing side of the economy, but even there, we've got 3 of those that are above 2%. The others are below, and most of the ones that are below are energy related. So fuel, oil, gasoline, things like that. So this is part of why we're seeing so much trouble with inflation coming down, is that yes, energy can pull down inflation, and we've seen oil prices dropping more as President Trump is talking about opening up more drilling, but the other items have not been coming down. More importantly, though, I think it's really what I've tried to focus on is what's the consumer experiencing, and this doesn't even reflect the consumer. What I've shown you on the next graph, these are the items that I would argue are core type of expenses for the consumer. Car insurance, auto insurance, utilities, physicians, things like that, as well as for the younger generation. So many of the younger generation saying, I'm not having kids until I can afford to buy a house. So my pets are my kids. Pet services up 12.1%. So this is the reality for the consumer. And I just went through the back of the envelope. I'm not going to say it's a high-tech analysis, but I went through looking off of the different sources and saying, what's the average rent price? What's the average grocery price for a family of 4? And gave the weighting for that to say, well, if their wages are this amount and this is what they're spending on these, even though the official number may say that auto insurance has a weighting of less than 1%, so it has no real impact on inflation, the consumer says, no, my auto insurance is a big number. I'm just like my rent is. So when I just did that quick calculation looking at this, the consumer's inflation rate is closer to 4.5%. And that's why the consumer is unhappy. More importantly, with these type of price increases, that's eating into their paycheck. So at some point, if it continues, if their wages don't keep pace, then they will be forced once again to start cutting back on discretionary purchases because they need to pay their other purchases. And we've actually got a situation in many parts of the US now where the homeowner's insurance plus property tax is more than your mortgage payment. Especially what we're seeing now with all the environmental things. Some places can't even find homeowners insurance. But this is where I say we need to monitor, because this is going to be a source of stress for the consumer. And then where I worry about for the consumer is the lower half of the wage earners, basically the hourly wage earners. Because the hourly wage earner doesn't have a investment portfolio that's generating great growth that can offset inflation. They don't have rental property that they can offset against inflation. What they have is their paycheck. And they're affected by that because they're an hourly worker. This is their pain. Average work week has been dropping because businesses are very hesitant to lay people off because they've said, you've told me for 3 years a recession is coming and it hasn't. So I don't want to lay somebody off and discover then my business picks back up and I got to hire that person back and pay more to get them back. So they've been cutting hours instead. I think I used this example last year. I'll use it again. If I'm a small business, I had 10 employees. I say I need to cut 40 hours. Normally, historically, I'd lay off one person and say that I've made my 40-hour savings. Now I'm saying I don't want to do that because I may have to get them back again. So I'll cut all of your hours. All 10 of you, I cut your hours by 4 hours. I get my 40-hour savings. I just impacted 10 people instead of one person. So I think this is something we need to monitor. It's kind of stabilized now, but it's stabilized on the low end with the average work week at 32.3 hours. So I think this is something, because what this is creating for the average, for the hourly worker, when they see their income dropping because their hours are dropping, we have this situation. We're near record highs for the number of people working multiple jobs. I would argue quite simply, very few people will voluntarily work multiple jobs. The only real category I'd say for that I see, because an employee at work is in that situation, he loves music. He's in a band, and they do get paid when they go perform on weekends. So that technically is working a second job, but most people are working a second job because their first paycheck isn't covering their bills. And so this is something I continue to monitor. I'm not going to say that, hey, this means we're heading for a recession right away. I'm just saying the headline news doesn't pick this up. This is the problem beneath the surface that we need to pay attention to, because if this problem gets worse and we start to see more and more charge off on debt and things like that, that's when it starts flowing to more and more people. And what we're seeing right now, what I'm showing you here are delinquency rates. You can't see the numbers or anything. I would just simply say the top two lines, the red and the brown line, are consumer debt. The red is credit card debt. The brown is overall debt. Very low level still, but what I say for that compared to the others is the trend has changed. It's now rising, and we need to pay attention to that. Same with charge-offs. You can see it more clearly on charge-offs. Same thing, credit card charge-offs are rising fairly strongly now. It's primarily with a lower income, not lower income, lower credit rating people. The people with credit scores below 400, they're starting to buckle on their debt. But I just simply say again, good risk managers will watch for signs of what's happening beneath the surface before it comes to the top, because by the time it comes to the top, it's become a big problem. So I think we need to watch what is happening with the average hourly worker to see just how much stress they are under that way. So we come to fiscal policy and say, well, you told me about monetary policy. What's going to happen with fiscal policy? And I'm not trying to sound flip, but I'm just going to give people reminders that what's promised during a campaign is not what happens once things come into place. We did not end the war with Ukraine and Russia before President Trump came into office, as he promised. I mean, those are just campaign promises. We should all hopefully be used to that. But I just simply say we will see what he actually is able to enact and what he does, because I will continue to argue President Trump style as a negotiator, even as a businessman. Somebody used this as a little graphic, but I think it's realistic. His style is punch you in the face and then say, now let's sit down and talk. So he gives these brash, I'm going to raise tariffs by 100% or 25% across the board. And what we saw very clearly was he announced, I'm going to raise tariffs 25% against Canada and Mexico because they're not doing their part. Less than 48 hours, he had conversations with both of those leaders of the thing. So I think we need to understand his negotiating style is different than traditional presidents. What I say more importantly we need to pay attention to as to what's going to happen with fiscal policy is, yes, the Republicans are in control of all three parts of government. No, the Republican Party is not a united party. We still have the far right and we have the middle. And the question is, will they be able to bring each other together to pass what President Trump wants, or is it going to be this back and forth battle to figure out what can get done there? And I think that's why we're going to see, we've already seen it, not that many yesterday, but President Trump has announced 200 executive orders will be out within the week. So he's going to use executive orders when Congress won't move fast enough for what he wants, and then that'll just have to be tested in court. Which ones will they allow, which ones will they not? President Biden discovered that as well. He used executive orders heavily. He got stopped by the Supreme Court when it came to to debt, where they said, no, you can't forgive debt. That has to go through Congress. So I think we'll see similar things, but I think we're definitely seeing, from the agenda that they have is that they want to start focusing on the debt. They want to do things, that will stimulate businesses, things like that. I just simply say, when I look at President Trump's policies, his four major agenda items, I think 2 could potentially be negative, 2 could potentially be positive. Tariffs, deportation, regulation, tax cuts. So the one thing that I do want to reemphasize once again, but I'm going to first get your feedback from you, how many of you or your businesses that you work with are going to be negatively impacted by tariffs? Either yes, no, or you can take the easy route and say, yet to be determined. So we'll give this just a few seconds. Looks like we've got over half of the people saying yes, they will be affected by tariffs. And that seems to be holding pretty steady, so I'll go ahead and take it from there. So businesses are going to be saying they will be affected by tariffs. What I want to emphasize over and over again, because I saw the same statement from President Trump yesterday, recognizing again, it's a political thing, but he said that he wants to form a Department of External Revenue Service to collect all this money that we're going to collect from these foreign countries for the tariffs we're going to assess them. And I just have to reemphasize, setting any politics aside one way or the other, pure economics is a tariff, when you impose a tariff, so if we're imposing a tariff on China or anybody else, when those goods land on the US docks, and you go to pick up those goods, Customs will say, you owe me for the tariff. So US businesses pay for tariffs. Other countries do not pay tariffs to the US. The other countries pay if businesses say, I'm going to stop doing business with that country. I can't afford that tariff. I'm going to go somewhere else. But that's not a tariff, and that's not revenue that comes to the US. So it sounds great to tell people, we're going to collect millions and millions of dollars in tariffs from these foreign countries. No, we're going to collect millions and millions of dollars from businesses. And I just try and emphasize to people, tariffs are just simply a tax, like other taxes. You pay income tax, you pay property tax, you pay potentially sales tax. So this will be something that business will adjust to if they're going to be subject to tariffs, just like they do for any of the other taxes. It'll be a line more for the accounting world, and now we want tariff specialists. How can we work to get around it? But if President Trump truly went through on what he claimed, we're going to tariff every single country that we import from, there's no getting around it then, because, I mean, that's what we'll have to see. Whether tariffs prove to be inflationary is a separate question. Yes, we could see a one-time increase in prices if businesses say, I got to pass that through. I can't absorb that, but they don't keep passing it on because we don't keep raising the tariff. At least that's not what's being discussed. So yes, that would be a one-time hit, but then we'd have higher prices as the new baseline. So I think we need to pay attention to that. That could be a negative. I would say the same for deportation. Deportation of people that are undocumented but are working, paying taxes in the US, all of that, and we say it doesn't matter, we're going to deport you, we're going to create a labor force problem because we're going to lose that pool of labor force. I've actually argued, and people look like me like I'm nuts or something, I said, actually the best worker you want for the US is an undocumented person who is working, paying their taxes, paying into Social Security because they don't qualify for Social Security. So we're helping the deficit in Social Security by having these people work, but we just need to watch and see because I saw even yesterday, President Trump once again has moderated what he said. He said we are going to be deporting millions of criminals and murderers and things like that. I don't think anybody argues with deporting illegal immigrants, and especially murderers and others like that. He did not address at all, what about the undocumented worker who's worked for 10 years in the US, paid taxes and everything else? We'll have to watch and see as that go. But the top two would potentially be negative if he actually follows through with what he says he wants to do with that. Offsets potentially would be the bottom two. If we have new tax cuts that help people, especially if he's talking about lowering the business tax from 21 to 15%, if that stimulates new investment in plant and equipment, productivity gains, things like that, that's a positive for the economy. If he really does reduce the amount of regulatory burden, that's another case where businesses then would have more money available to be able to invest in their business, become more productive, generate more sales. I can tell you just simply quickly from the banking industry, I think that we now have a compliance department at the bank that is almost as big, if not bigger, than our lending team. And yet you say, and what revenue are they generating for us? They're preventing having examiners show up and threatening to put restrictions on you and things like that. So I think the bottom two, tax cuts and regulations, could definitely be the positive for the economy. But my main point I make is we are way too early to know what the actual answer is going to be. But this would be the time, I would argue, that you start building a contingency plan saying, if I've got exposure, what's my game plan, things like that. So I think that what I want to give you then to close off, those are things that we need to be thinking about. I didn't say necessarily worrying about. I just say as any good businessman, you're always planning for what's the risk that could come back and bite me. Those are the ones I think you should look at. When it comes to the Treasure Valley economy and the Idaho economy, I'm going to just simply tell you, not to quite the point, because I still have this song playing in my head forever. My 8-year-old grandson, car rides, he plays this one song over and over again. It's everything is awesome. And I'm going to say, well, I wouldn't quite say everything is awesome. But for the Idaho economy, compared to the U.S. economy, that's probably where you're saying sometimes where you're hearing all that negative news of recession's coming. What are you talking about? Things seem pretty strong here. Well, the facts support that case because when we look at jobs for Idaho, what we see is Idaho on the red is double the growth rate of the U.S., more than double. U.S. 1.4% for the U.S. Idaho, year over year through November, was 3.1%. Boise or the Treasure Valley, and according to the government, Boise is Nampa through Boise itself. Treasure Valley, up 4.3%. Clearly some of that boosted by Micron, because construction was one of the industries that did see jobs growth. But that's a good sign to say that you've got jobs growth happening. What I would highlight for Idaho as a whole, and it's the same story for the US, Idaho's jobs growth was very concentrated jobs growth. You had 3 industries that had no growth. You had, and that's financial activities, professional business services, education, and healthcare had 0 growth. You had 3 industries that had negative growth, and then you had 4 industries with positive growth, with government and leisure and hospitality leading the way, but also construction and manufacturing up over 4%. So there may be a story there as well when you're saying, hey, the jobs growth looks great, but you talk to somebody who's working in leisure and hospitality or in financial services, they may say, what are you talking about? You know, we're not hiring, or we've actually lost people. So we have to keep that in perspective. But overall, good jobs growth. Good job growth is leading to the labor force of saying if you want to continue to grow jobs, you have to have your labor force grow to fill the new job openings that you have. And so Idaho, once again, far better than the US at 3% compared to the US barely positive. And once again, Treasure Valley, the best at 4.6%. I've got a new phrase for you, though, that somebody here in Idaho gave me that I will share with everybody, because you always want to have something to throw at somebody, because I said, watch out for the cows. And when the person first said that, I thought, what are you talking about? Ag's not a very big part of the Idaho economy, and especially dairy. He says, no. California, Oregon, Washington, they're all moving to Idaho. And that is true. When you look at the demographics, that is exactly happening. And so that has helped fuel the growth for Idaho, but it's also now creating growth pains. And so I wanted to highlight that as well, because what we see, we have solid wage growth for some of these areas. You know, the Treasure Valley, 11% wage growth. But I tell people over and over again, don't think you're going to move to Treasure Valley and get an 11% wage growth. It's because you had negative growth in leisure and hospitality, you had negative growth in other services, the 2 lowest paying industries, you had positive growth in construction and manufacturing, higher paying industries. So this is simple math of saying when you drop out lower paying jobs, replace them with higher paying, year-over-year comparison looks like a nice healthy growth, but it's not because the business gave you an 11% gain. Don't try and go back to your business and say, hey, the economist just said there's 11% wage growth. How come I only got 4%? How come I only got 3%? That's not what I'm trying to communicate here. But it's a solid number overall. Same for Pocatello. You know, it's a smaller place for one, but you just need to add a few more high-paying jobs, lose a few low-paying in a small area, and you get big percentage numbers. The thing, though, that's a challenge for Idaho is you still have the case that every single region of Idaho, including the Treasure Valley, the average monthly wage is below the U.S. average. I'll tell you why that's not a problem in just a second, but remember that as I gave you that, because the next thing I want to highlight for you is that when we look at economic growth again, I already showed you the blue line before for the U.S. You can see Idaho's economy has consistently been stronger than the U.S. U.S. at 2.7%. For the year over year for the third quarter, Idaho was 4.6%. So you're not imagining things when you say, I don't know what they're talking about with this weakness. It seems like we're doing a lot better. You are doing a lot better, and you should celebrate that. So I think that's where I want to highlight again is just the risks or the growing pains to consider. What Idaho's challenge is, I told you there's no region in Idaho where average wage is above the U.S. Only Pocatello has home prices below the U.S. That's not a good combination to say if I want to buy a house, to say my wages are below the U.S., but my home price is above the U.S. So what you end up with is very clearly, and I ran it through it for you last year, I'll tell you again, I do a simple math of just saying, if I take the average home price, current mortgage rates, say, what's that mortgage payment? Then I say, what percentage of your average paycheck is consumed by your mortgage payment? Your mortgage banker or your financial institution will tell you, we want that to be 35% or less. Might consider 40% if we go with one of the government programs. And so what we see, though, if you want to buy a house with one income, so you've got the second income for saving for retirement, paying for daycare, things like that, that is not feasible for Idaho, because the best situation you have is Idaho falls at 43%. That's still above the 35 to 40% range. The worst case being, of course, Coeur d'Alene, with so many of their multi-million-dollar homes there. But the bottom line is, throughout Idaho, it takes 2 paychecks to buy a house. Now, that's no problem, as long as the economy is doing well. But if you're relying on 2 paychecks to make your mortgage payment, something happens with one of those paychecks, you lose your job, you get your hours cut, you got a problem. And that's where you're then forced involuntarily to start cutting back on all the other discretionary spending, because you still got to make your mortgage payment, you got to make your property tax payment, those types of things. So this is the growing pain that Idaho has that needs to be addressed. As I said last year, and I'll say it again this year, if that continues, what you will see is you've already been the beneficiary of expensive homes on the West Coast, people moving inland, and so they came into Idaho. Pretty soon they'll say, I can't afford to live here now, or a business will say, I can't afford to move here because my employees can't live here, so we're going to keep moving inward towards wherever that might be, because you can still go to the middle of the country, the Midwest, and you can still afford to buy a 2,500 square foot home on one income. You'd be able to qualify. So I just think this is where Idaho, as a state, Treasure Valley, as a community, are going to have to get their stakeholders all come together and agree we have to support this growth, which means that we have to support new schools if you need them. You got to support new roads being built, and you have to support new neighborhoods being built. I've always argued with people, how come it was okay to build your neighborhood, but now you're going to fight tooth and nail not to let somebody build that next neighborhood next to you? And yet that's what's needed if we want to continue to attract people into Idaho and keep them, because this is the situation that, thanks to remote work to some degree, younger people may be willing to move to live in Emmett, Idaho right now and work for somebody in Boise. But if we ever go to a full 5 days a week, that's a big issue. And more just from a general standpoint, people don't want to be living the Los Angeles or the Seattle lifestyle that I got to live ultimately 2 hours away, because that's how far I have to go before I can get a house that I can afford. Because even Caldwell is now unaffordable. So I think those are the things we have to pay attention to. My closing thoughts for you are, once again, I encourage you strongly, ignore the noise of politics. People who did last year did well, and the economy did well. I think, though, especially those of you in the CPA world, but all business people here, I think when there's this level of uncertainty and the noise that goes on with social media and everything, I think we all have an important role to be the voice of reason and objectivity. When our employees are expressing distress or worry that, oh my God, did you just see what was on the news today? That you're saying, well, how does that affect our business? How does that affect your job? Oh, it doesn't. Well, let's stay focused then. Same for clients. I would also say this is the time to be advising your clients, or you yourself, having active discussions with your vendors to make sure that they're in solid shape, that they're not going to have a major problem with tariffs or things like that, so that you can have a game plan. Because the last thing you want to do is say, hey, I am ready for the next recession. I'm good to go. I got my game plan. If it happens, I'm ready. Then the recession hits, and suddenly you discover you lost your vendors. And you go, ooh, that wasn't in my game plan. So I think those are the things I would be telling you to think about is, while times are good, is when you should be having the conversations with yourself, your business, and your clients and your vendors. So what are you doing to be ready if the next recession comes along? But on the same side, I would emphasize over and over again, have the game plan, but don't execute on it. There's been way too many times, even during the last administration, oh my God, they're going to do this, and you spend all the money to adapt for that change, and then it didn't happen after all. So, like I said, have the game plan, be ready, but don't execute until you actually see what gets passed and what's happening there. So let me close there. Let's use our QR code and see what we have now. In order for prices to come down. So the question is, in order for prices to come down, don't we need negative inflation rather than just a slower rate? Absolutely. That is the only way. That's what I keep telling people is the disconnect between government and the Fed and the consumer is the Fed says we need to bring inflation down to 2%. And the consumer says, no, you don't. You need to bring prices down because prices are too high. And the only way historically that you see price cuts is either through major technological innovation, where we bring prices down that way, or a recession. That then prices come down, and then the goal is to keep them at that lower rate and don't let them come surging back up again. So you're absolutely right. 2% inflation does not bring prices down. It does not help the consumer. And that is what the consumer cares about is prices, not inflation. The Fed cares about inflation. The government cares about inflation. The consumer cares about prices. Do I click or do you click to move to the next one? Oh, sorry. Solid economy, do you see certain industries struggling more than others, industries showing particular strength? Well, we see for the Treasure Valley, especially for Idaho, the ones that are struggling, And I guess that what I would say for general that I've observed for the U.S., white-collar jobs are actually where you're struggling. If you lose your job in a white-collar job, I can't tell you how amazed I've been just looking at LinkedIn. I've seen like 6 different posts where somebody says, I've been out of work for 6 months, I can't even get able to return my calls. And then it's like 300 responses saying, same here, same here. And I'm like, whoa, that's not getting picked up anywhere in the press. But the bottom line is, since technology led the layoffs, technology has probably still been the weakest sector. Fine if you have a job, but it's a struggle if you don't. I think other industries that are struggling, manufacturing has clearly been struggling for the U.S. as a whole. Can't say that for the Treasure Valley, especially with the Micron project, that you've got manufacturing going on there. But I think that's another area that is slowly starting to make a comeback. Leisure and hospitality is another area, just because of the pressure on their profit margins. If they continue to see rising prices, they can't raise their restaurant prices. They hit a point where people just say, I can't afford to go out to dinner anymore. So I think those are probably the industries that I would say where there's been struggles. Healthcare has struggled more with finding enough workers versus saying that the industry itself is having a major problem. And then the strength has clearly been in construction for the Treasure Valley, but also we have seen government jobs because of the state capital. Doesn't seem like government loses jobs very often. They seem to have more growth. But those are probably the 2 major industries that have been the strongest for the Treasure Valley. Everybody else, I would say, is just kind of in the middle, chugging along. Next. How will AI impact the employment, growth, and inflation? So one thing I will say is, even for old dogs like us, is that AI is here to stay. We can say all we want. It has plenty of things that needs to be worked through to figure it out. But I would still argue that AI role is going to be more the assistant rather than the elimination of different jobs. Now, yes, a lot of repetitive type of stuff that may replace things there. I think the other place where AI will definitely have an impact, where it will eliminate some jobs and create new jobs, is what they call physical AI. I was just finished reading an article earlier this week where they were talking about we're actually getting to the stage where the Jetsons may actually come into play, because they've actually got a robotic maid now that the difference is, normally with the robotics, they have a set of rules. And it could be millions of rules, but if this happens, you do this. And that's where the biggest struggle was, especially for like self-driving cars. It couldn't adapt to the different things that were going on. Now they've got AI incorporated in there. So AI is kind of a brain. So adaptive learning, it's adjusting, it's figuring it out. And I saw the 2 videos that they were just showing it as an example. One was this Rosie, the maid from the Jetsons, was actually cleaning a house, could recognize stairs, do that type of thing. The other one that was fascinating to watch was a robot they had in Asia, Vietnam, one of those places, harvesting rice. And they just go on and harvest it, pick it. I mean, he carried these massive bales compared to a person. So that puts at risk that you may have certain types of jobs like that eliminated, but you then need people manufacturing those items. I think it's going to be a huge boom for U.S. manufacturing, and you need jobs, that cross-train to be into those jobs. As a general rule, when you increase productivity, inflation, that's when we saw during the last 20 years, prices coming down so much for computers and everything else, because you can make them cheaper, be more productive, more power to them, and not have to raise prices. So I think that AI long-term should be a positive force against inflation. I'm not saying we won't have inflation, but it will help keep a lid on inflation. It will increase productivity, and it will displace one group. It'll be the new industrial revolution, that you lost your job on the farm, you had to learn how to come and work in a factory. It'll be a similar thing like that. I just simply say the transition from here to there is the great unknown of how quick is that going to happen, what's going to happen, where are the distortions going to happen, where people screaming, you can't do this to me, and that type of thing. The power of a union saying you can't eliminate these jobs because we don't have that one that's being created as a union job, those types of things. But I think that the train is rolling that way. The new revolution is in process, and it's going to be fascinating to watch over the next 5 to 10 years to see what we have then versus what we have right now. How would you address the Idaho wage to mortgage expense issue? Well, the basic key for Idaho is that continuing to bring in higher paying jobs versus lower paying. One of Idaho's problems before the pandemic crisis and the inflation issue was Idaho attracted a lot of businesses because you paid the national minimum wage of 7.25, when all of your neighboring states were paying much higher. And you still got the advantage. I mean, you got the, I'm going to say bias, this ridiculous situation in California and now Washington, where minimum wage for Washington, I think, is supposed to hit $20 an hour by the end of the year. Well, there's a lot of businesses that are just saying, I'm done. And a lot of restaurants are closing in the Seattle marketplace saying, I can't make money at those levels. So I think that the solution isn't to mandate a higher minimum wage, because unless you actually did that at a national level, people will just move to somewhere else where it was cheaper. It's got to be attracting those businesses that pay higher paying. So whether it's tech jobs, construction jobs, manufacturing, those types of industries you want to incent and get them to come to you. The other ones, you're not trying to make them leave, but you're not actively recruiting to say, hey, let's bring 100 more restaurants in, just to watch them slowly close their doors as they can't make money that way. So I think that's, for Idaho, the way you raise the wage is target the industries that will have higher paying wages and give them incentives to come to Idaho, rather than the blanket incentive you had before, where any business who came to Idaho and created, I think it was 10 jobs, I forget, there was a tax credit for them. Refine that down now to target the type of business you want to bring in and say, this is what we want for the future. I think I've talked kind of in line with why Idaho wages stayed low? Do you expect them to increase, and why? They've stayed low because you had that low base of the minimum wage, and it wasn't until COVID came along and now McDonald's and everybody else pays $14 an hour. That was a market-driven process. So I think slowly you're going to see the average wage for Idaho rising, but you are so much more below the U.S. than before that you've got a ways to go before you finally get to where you need to be. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think I answered that question. What do I see happening with interest rates in 2025? Short-term rates maybe coming down, long-term rates stable to maybe higher. Unless something happens to the economy and things start to, the economy really starts to slow, then long-term rates will start to come down. So what regional and national impact do you expect from the Los Angeles fires, building materials, insurance, etc.? So the one regional impact is, as I told you before, watch out for the cows, because people are going to be saying, I don't want to live here anymore. Maybe I should move somewhere else where there isn't as much of a fire hazard. I think from what I've seen and everything I continue to see, the impact of the LA fires is going to be concentrated in California, has a minimal overall impact, but it does continue the trend. And it's not an immediate trend, but we already have cases that insurance companies are using drones, and they're identifying neighborhoods where you're buried inside the trees. And a lot of people are saying, I can't believe how much my insurance rate went up. And it's because they're saying, fire hits there, that's a big claim, versus open areas. So I think that you're going to see insurance companies more and more discerning and saying, which they have the ability to do, we will just, since they're controlled by state insurance commissioners, they're limited sometimes on how much they can raise their rates. So instead they say, we're just done. They pulled out of Florida, many insurance companies saying, we can't absorb those continued hurricane impacts because they're happening more frequently. I think you're going to see the same for California. And ultimately, they're going to start distinguishing for every state what's the riskiest part, what's not as risky. And there's a big difference now between if you live close to the wildlands, the trees and everything, you're going to probably see a far higher insurance rate than if you live in a suburban area or something like that where there's not that type of exposure. So I think that's probably the biggest risk, but I think that it could accelerate more people saying, I don't want to live here anymore, and deciding where do I want to live. And Idaho continues to hit the top rankings for different things, great place for businesses, great place for quality of life, this type of thing. So that is a risk to saying you can have continued in-migration, and can you handle that as a state and absorb it without causing all kind of traffic jams and everything else. So I'm going to leave it at that. Appreciate the time for everybody coming and listening today. Now you get your chance. You've heard from the economic side. I'll turn it over so that you can learn what's going on in the tax world. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. All right. Thank you again, Steve, for for that speech. It was great. Always good info. Now we're going to switch gears to our tax planning, our kind of tax outlook. Obviously, a lot of things have happened the last couple months, which is exciting. We also were already looking at a lot of things from a tax perspective over the next couple of years. So it'll be great to bring up our next couple speakers to talk. Renee Davis from KDP has over 20 years of experience doing both domestic and multinational companies and is in our Boise tax practice. And Todd Ames, a partner in our Twin Falls office, also has been over 20 years of experience doing tax planning and strategies for his clients. So with that, welcome Renee and Todd.
Thanks, Josh.
So after a riveting economic portion, everybody probably needs to stand up and do the little shake because now we get tax, right? Yeah, everybody's just been waiting all year long to talk about tax. So we're excited to be here. And we are excited that you're patient and kind, and you'll clap when we're done, no matter what you think about our presentation. But we have a lot to talk about today. We're excited to share what we do know and recognize that there's a lot that we don't know. And so today's going to be a little bit fun and a little bit frustrating because you're going to leave today and say, wait a minute, they didn't really tell me anything. And that's because there's not a lot that we actually know. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah. We don't have a crystal ball, so we'll tell you what we've heard. There are some knowns. But without tax legislation, we'll see what happens. So there's some knowns with respect to 2025, and then there are some things that came up during, the campaign that were proposals that were discussed that Steve talked about, where we get promised a lot of things. We'll see where we actually land.
Exactly. All right. Well, this is our agenda. So first, we're going to talk about what we do know. And that is, at the end of 2025, there will be a sunset of many tax provisions that were enacted back for 2018 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And then we're going to talk about potential legislation, meaning during the campaign, we heard a lot of rhetoric, we heard a lot of promises, a lot of suggestions, and we're going to go through those and see how those could impact us. Then we're going to talk a little bit, like Steve mentioned, what's the reality, or what are the hurdles that we may encounter as we see if these things can come into law, or if there will be changes or not. And then our final piece that hopefully can be helpful is maybe some takeaways of how do we plan in this changing landscape. There's a lot of uncertainties. And so that's where we're headed.
So to kick us off, I think let's kind of level set. If we don't have legislation, what do we know is going to happen at the end of 2025? So back with tax reform, there were a lot of provisions that were introduced, some of which were made permanent. Again, not changing unless we have legislation to do so. And so we'll walk through those, what were permanent, what's not going to expire at 2025, and then we'll chat through, okay, well, now that's what's not expiring. What might expire that we should be prepared for, unless we get some legislation to either extend it or change it in some fashion. So if we start over towards the right side of the screen, what's permanent? There was a corporate rate reduction that got a lot of news. A lot of C corporations were very excited. Before that legislation took place back in 2017, the US had the fourth highest corporate tax rate in the world at 35%. So that was reset down to 21% effective 2018 and forward, which now the US tax rate's basically the middle of the pack. So that's why that reset needed to happen, just because optically 35% is really high. The effective rate that corporations were actually paying was somewhat lower because there were a lot of different offsets to that 35%. But this gets the US more in line with the rest of the globe and makes us more competitive when it comes to our big corporations that are operating on the world stage. Another change that came into being that impacts our C corporations was a decrease to the dividends received deduction. So on a corporate tax return, if you receive dividends from an affiliate, you don't have to pay tax on 100% of those dividends, because that in essence is triple taxation. So that used to be between, you know, a 50 to 70% deduction, and that got decreased down. So that's going to stay permanent. Another permanent provision that was introduced was impacts folks with respect to their tax accounting methods. So before, there was a $5 million threshold to determine if you were a small business. And if you were a small business, you could use the cash basis of accounting and other tax accounting methods. If you were above that $5 million in gross receipts, that's how they determined whether you were a small business or not. They looked at your 3 years prior average gross receipts. If it was $5 million or less, you're a small business, you can be a cash basis taxpayer. If you were over that, then you had to switch to accrual basis of accounting, which is kind of a negative, because if you think about it, you're accelerating income and paying tax on income before you get the cash in the door. So a lot of folks don't approve like accrual accounting. This provision was really nice because it raised that $5 million threshold to $25 million. So we saw a lot of clients making, filing accounting method changes to move from accrual back to cash basis, so they could align their tax liability and tax payments with the way that cash was actually coming in the door. So that was a hugely beneficial provision for all businesses, not just C corporations. A provision that was wildly impactful down here at the bottom was the treatment of research and experimentation costs. And this was a very unpopular position, if you will. So the US always wants to spur and provide incentives for innovation and growth here in the US, right? We want good, high-paying jobs. So let's give incentives to companies to invest in innovation. So companies used to have a decision they could make. Do I want to capitalize and amortize my research and experimentation costs, or do I want to deduct them in the year? With tax reform coming in, that was changed. Companies no longer have that flexibility to either capitalize and amortize those costs or deduct them. And so this was really impactful and very unpopular, because if you can imagine, if you spend $1 million on research and experimentation, you can't deduct that anymore. You have to capitalize it. Well, that could cause tax. So where's the incentive for me to continue being innovative? I mean, one, you don't want to go out of business, but also, it's a cash flow issue now, because you could, in essence, owe more in tax because you can no longer deduct those costs. There were a lot of bipartisan bills introduced to try and take us back to the pre-tax reform rules so that we could continue deducting and give companies that flexibility, but they kind of died with the House, with the Senate actually. One passed in 2024, the House, and then it just stalled on the Senate floor. So we'll see what happens in the future on that one. Another provision that was introduced that was taxpayer unfavorable was a limitation on the amount of interest expense that a company could deduct. Again, if you're a small business, you don't have to worry about this. So again, that $25 million threshold, which is indexed for inflation, is a good thing when it comes to interest expense and whether you're limited or not. So if your adjusted taxable income is a loss, you could actually end up paying tax because of this provision if you were driven into a loss from interest expense. So what you do is you figure out my taxable income, add back my interest expense, and then my amount of interest I can deduct is 30% of that adjusted number. So if you had a loss of $100,000, but you had interest expense of $200,000 that created that loss, you add back the 200. Now you have income of $100,000. In essence, you can only deduct 30% of that, or $30,000. So you have taxable income of 70 grand. So that was a negative for some of our clients that have large interest expense deductions. Another provision that was made permanent was an increase to the amount you could deduct with respect to capital expenditures or equipment. So there's a provision called Section 179 that allows you to immediately expense items. This is different than bonus depreciation. This is an election that you can make. And the amount before tax reform that you could immediately expense was increased to $1 million, and the phase out was also increased and pegged to limitation. So it continues to rise, and this is a huge benefit to a lot of small businesses. And then lastly, the like-kind exchange rules. This is if you have property and, like, say, a rental, and you sell it for a gain. If you identify like property, you can roll that gain into the like property and not pay tax on it. There was a change in tax reform. Before tax reform took place in 2017, you could do the same thing if you had a fleet of vehicles, like that's personal property, and you wanted to refresh your fleet. Let's say you were a rental car company, and every 3 years you refresh your fleet by selling those old rental car companies. You could roll any gain into the new fleet and not pay tax on it. That went away with tax reform. So like-kind exchanges only apply to real property going forward. So those are the permanent provisions. Now we're going to pick up and chat through what are some of the things that might be expiring at the end of 2025 unless we get some legislation.
Great. So, and when we say permanent, we mean unless tax legislation happens to change them permanently again.
Right.
But they are not sunsetting. So those are the ones that we're keeping. So these are, we're not going to cover every single line item unless somebody has a question. So by the way, the QR code, if you have a question, if you see something and we don't touch on it, shoot those questions in and Victoria will make sure that we address those later. So but these are the ones that are actually expiring at the end of 2025. So the first one that I think is probably important to talk about is rates and brackets. And what that means is all of the rate reductions that happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act now go away. So they go back up. The top rate goes from 37 to 39.6. You know, in the lower brackets, the 12% becomes 15, the 15 becomes 20, and everything such and so forth. And the size of the brackets will shrink back down to what they were at that time as well. Translation, what does that mean? It means more tax. Same income, you would just see an increase in your income tax. Not a good thing. Other things, also standard deductions, personal exemptions, if anybody remembers those things, those would all come back. Okay, those are scheduled to come back. With the itemized deductions, the one that will affect most people is the SALT cap, or the state and local tax deduction. There was a $10,000 cap placed on that. That goes away at the end of this year. So if there is one bright spot, that might be something that's bright. Otherwise, all of the other changes in itemized deductions also reverts back to what it was prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So you would see miscellaneous itemized deductions come back and things of that nature. And then skipping down to the bottom a little bit, one that I think for the last several years we've forgotten about is AMT, or the Alternative Minimum Tax. Right about that time that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was put in place, more and more American families were having to pay the alternative minimum tax. And what that is, it's a whole different way to calculate income tax that tries to ensure, from the government standpoint, that we don't do our jobs well enough. That we haven't figured out how to skirt around enough things to help you. And so they said, well, no matter what, there's going to be a minimum. Well, the exemptions, the hurdles, if you will, for AMT, they had never really grown or kept pace with inflation. And so in 2018, those were bumped significantly. And so middle-class America was saved, if you will, from the AMT problem. Well, guess what? That all goes away and reverts back to what it was at that time. So, absent legislation, I would dare say everyone in this room will probably need to have a conversation about AMT, okay? A couple other things at the bottom there, child tax credits, we'll touch on those a little bit later. Those would just revert into back to what they were before. Next slide, yeah. All right, so as we continue on, I think the top one there that's highlighted, QBI. That is who, by raise of hands, business owners, who has a pass-through entity, S corporation, partnership, in your repertoire? Yeah. Okay, so far, for the last several years, you've enjoyed a 20% deduction for the income that's passing through from those entities to your personal tax return. That goes away at the end of this year if there's no legislation. So an automatic tax increase. So don't you don't have rotten tomatoes at your table, right? These is just what's slated to happen. And I think that's really important. There's a few other things on there, but those two are the really big ones that I think we should focus on for right now as far as expiring provisions.
And that was hugely impactful, right? Because like, if you have a business that makes $1 million in taxable income and you're in the top bracket of 37%, you would pay $370,000 in federal tax. With the qualified business income deduction, you in essence would pay, 27% or something? You'd save in essence $74,000. So you'd pay $296,000 instead of $370,000. So it's real money. So that would be really impactful for a lot of our pass-through companies if it goes away. And 9 out of 10 businesses in the U.S. are pass-through entities. So it's going to impact a lot of taxpayers.
It's interesting because we do get a lot of discussion about the permanent rate of 21%, and that really applies to C corporations, which we have quite a lot, especially our public companies. They're less popular in the middle market that we service, and so, yeah, we'll have a lot of people affected. And the last piece here at the bottom, which is one that gets a lot of press, and that is the estate and gift tax exemption rules. You might remember, anybody who's vintage, back in the day there was like a 600,000 estate exemption, and then it went to $1 million, and then we had the Bush regime, and it went to like 5 million, and then it went away. And we're all like, whoa, that's great. Then it came back, so there's this yo-yo effect with this rule. And in 2018, what happened was it was bumped significantly, and today it's 13.99, so we say $14 million per person of an exemption for your estate. And that correlates with gifting, so if you're gifting away a portion of your estate, you have that lifetime cap. Well, those rules go back to what they were, and so indexed for inflation, it should be around 7 million. Now, that may or may not impact every American family, but for those who have significant assets, that's a big deal, because the tax rate on those amounts over those limits is 40%. So if you had $1 million over the exemption, you can count on $400,000 leaving your estate. And if your estate were comprised mainly of real estate, for example, or a farming activity, your heirs could be forced to liquidate in order to pay that tax. So it is now possible that the days of looking at alternative ways to fund that tax, if you can't get around it, trusts, life insurance, all of the old things could come back into play if this is not legislatively extended. Is that right?
Which I think leads us into potential tax legislation. And I know Steve talked about this too, like tax cuts could be something that's a positive for economic growth in the future. So where might those tax cuts happen? And so if we just look back to what was said during the campaign, what was on the campaign website for the Trump administration, and pick out like, okay, what have they talked about changing? For the first one that got a lot of press, again, goes back to our C corporations and their income tax rates. One would be an across-the-board decrease to 20%. And then if that corporation is producing most of their goods here in the United States, which we like to support U.S. manufacturing, they could actually pay a corporate tax rate of 15%. So it sounds great, but then you get into the details, right? Well, define what is producing goods in the United States. What if I have components that come in from overseas? Does it have to be 100% here? What if I do all the design here? Is it going to be based on cost? So it'll get trickier as things get discussed during the legislative process.
Absolutely.
Other changes potentially are with respect to the treatment of income. So with tax reform, it introduced qualified opportunity zone investments. And what this was a vehicle to entice capital to areas within the United States that may have challenges in attracting capital. So they might be in riskier areas or just hard to get to. And so what this did was it said, hey, if you investor have large capital gains and are willing to invest in these qualified opportunity zones, which there are 8,700 throughout the US, we will allow you to defer paying that capital gain until 2026. And then if you hold that investment for a long period of time, say 10 years, any appreciation you might experience on that investment will be tax-free once you sell it. So that goes away at the end of 2025, and they've discussed extending that. So instead of it sunsetting, it would just continue. Other items that have been discussed, one is the qualified business income deduction. So hooray, it might stick around, right? Instead of sunsetting, we might be able to keep it, which would be hugely impactful, again, for our clients and the middle market businesses. So fingers crossed on that one. Losses for non-corporate taxpayers. So this is if anybody has a flow-through entity that's kicking out losses on their individual tax return. If those losses were more than $250,000 if you were single, or $500,000 if you're married filing joint, then you were limited to only being able to deduct that $250,000 or $500,000, and that was pegged to inflation. It's up to like $560,000 or something married filing joint. This would actually sunset also, so those limitations would no longer apply. But there's talk of keeping that legislation in place and extending it so that that limitation would continue to apply if we get new legislation. R&D expensing, they're talking about going back to the pre-tax reform law. So again, giving companies the ability to make a choice. Hey, do I want to capitalize and amortize these costs or deduct them? Which would be hugely beneficial to our companies who are innovative in the US by allowing them to take those deductions or do some planning. Maybe they don't need the deduction today, so they do want to capitalize and amortize, but it brings back that flexibility. So we'll see where that goes, because that's been a popular one to try and take back to pre-tax reform. And there's been a lot of talk around energy. I don't think it's going to be any shock where the Trump administration wants to support our more traditional energy source industries, if you will, in the hopes of becoming more energy independent when we look across the world stage. So they've talked about repealing some of the incentives and tax credits specific to renewable energy, like the electric vehicle credits and things of that nature, and supporting more of our traditional or fossil fuel type industries going forward. So we'll see where that ends up.
In fact, yesterday, after the inauguration, Steve alluded to the fact there were many executive orders that were written. Actually, some of these were affected. A moratorium on wind production, and drill baby drill, I think, was the catchphrase that we heard from President Trump yesterday. So these are definitely on their minds.
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting because I was just curious, because I'm a nerd, and so I went and I looked it up. Like, well, what is the spending on renewable or clean energy, if you will, versus the more traditional? And for the first time in history, in 2024, investment in clean energy was double that of traditional or fossil fuel industries, and the leading investor is China. So I thought that was fascinating. Kind of made me think back to, you know, the 80s where, you know, the foreign cars were taking off and kind of making inroads into the US. So it'll be curious. I'm curious to see what comes of
that'll be fun.
the energy policy.
All right. Some individual tax. So this is probably where a lot more of the rhetoric came during the campaign. And so, you know, for most of these slides, you'll see what the provision is, what the current law is today, and what the proposal is, okay? So back to our discussion on interest rates, tax rates. As you can see, there's the brackets today, 10, 12, 22, and so forth. Trump's proposal is simple: extend that, okay? The part of that proposal, go ahead real quick.
Did you want to go back?
One part of that proposal that is interesting is maybe off the cuff, but maybe not, a proposal to replace the individual income tax with tariffs. Steve alluded to that as well, but on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about it. There's about $2.2 trillion that comes in from individual income taxes into the federal budget. In order to replace that, That would be an across-the-board, approximately 58% tariff on all imports, according to studies. That's a lot. And so when we asked that question earlier, would tariffs affect your business? Now I think everybody in the room would say, well, if it doesn't affect my business, it's going to affect me. Look right here, line number 5. Economists have estimated if these tariffs go in place, and we'll get to what has actually been talked about, every family would see an increase in cost of between $1,700 and $4,000. That's if we get to a universal baseline of 10%, maybe 20%, and if we do get 60% on China. Now, if we switch that rhetoric to 58% on all tariffs, for all incoming products, this $4,000 now becomes more like $15,000 impact to every American family. Is that reality? Is that 100% accurate? It's statistics, it's calculations and things, but it's eye-opening to think, what will that do? Well, okay, so maybe we don't pay individual income tax, but what are we doing? We're paying more. So it's not really a tax savings per se, it's more of a shift in how the tax is paid. Instead of an income tax, it becomes a consumption tax. You're paying tax on what you buy or what you import instead of on what you earn. We all know there's no such thing as a free lunch. If we get a tax break somewhere, unless we cut a program or change something, there's going to be a compensating tax probably. And so that's what I think when we talk about tariffs, that's probably the thing that I would say is a good takeaway to think about as we watch what does evolve during the year. And that is, what does it mean if it changes my individual income tax, but tariffs go up, how's my family budget going to be impacted?
Yeah. If we're lucky, it'll be a 1-to-1, right? But
yeah. All right, capital gains. Capital gains has been interesting. President Trump instituted or made these current provisions of 0% capital gain if you happen to be in a bracket up to the 12% bracket, and then everything else is 15%. And if your income exceeds certain levels, the capital gain rate's 20%. The proposal is that we reduce or basically eliminate the 20% bracket, and that all capital gain top rate is 15%. That's the proposal that he has. The interesting proposal that has floated, which those tax accountants in the room would probably cringe, but taking what we call the purchase price or basis of an investment and have that indexed for inflation. So if you bought it for $100, if you bought IBM stock for $100 a share, and then you wait 20 years to sell it, your cost basis would not be $100 anymore. It would be 100 plus inflation. That is a definite job security act for accountants right there. And thinking about dealing with that is a little bit, what would I say at the beginning, fun and frustrating? A little fun because it's new, a little frustrating because it's kind of annoying. But those are the things that have been talked about. And I think something to keep in mind is what will come into play. Again, you're going to walk away recognizing we don't know. But these are what's been talked about.
I think this is where I'm hoping for AI if we have to do this. I'll just get Robot Renee to just crank that out.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure. All right. So we'll go through this one pretty quickly. Unless you're a hedge fund mogul, number one probably doesn't apply to most of us with carried interest. But the rest of these are interesting. Social Security, tip income, overtime pay. The proposal is that all of those be 100% exempted from income tax as well as payroll tax. That would be interesting. Currently, Social Security benefits are taxable up to 85% of the benefit. Up to 85% of the benefit would be subject to tax. Careful how I say that. And these proposals would make them all exempt, which it creates some logistical questions, like how would you even go about doing that? So you got payroll systems that have to be revamped. You'd have, if we thought that cash under the table non-reporting was an issue before, this would make the whole landscape change a lot, I think. So the tax gap could be interesting. All right, as we talked about, the standard deduction would reduce, personal exemptions would come back. the proposal is to simply extend what we have now. The AMT, the proposal or the rhetoric, has been to continue what we have now and not let it revert back, which I think would be a great move to save all of America from paying that. And then itemized deductions, basically to keep all of those as they are currently, with the exception of the one on the next slide, which is the SALT cap. And the proposal is to eliminate that. So allow the itemized deductions to stay as they are, but to eliminate the SALT cap. So if that happens, that would kind of be the best of both worlds. You keep the higher standard deduction if that applies, you eliminate the SALT cap, which will bring into question something that we'll talk about a little bit later, and that is the pass-through entity, at least in most states, but Idaho has what we call ABE, the affected business entity, which is where it allows a pass-through entity to pay the tax for the business, and then you get a federal tax deduction. One of the greatest things since sliced bread as far as the tax nerds are concerned, because that's great, and then you still get credit for paying it. Well, if you eliminate the SALT cap, that will call into question the need, in some cases, for the pass-through entity tax deduction, and correlating that. So it'll be interesting to see if that passes and what that will do with the pass-through entity tax as well. We have some limitation on mortgage interest deduction. So curiosity question: did anybody know that if you have a mortgage balance greater than $750,000, you cannot deduct all of your mortgage interest? It used to be $1 million. The current law is $750,000, and the proposal is to continue the $750,000, not let it revert back. Now, these two bottom ones, I think, are curious. We have chuckled a lot as we went through all these potential tax legislations. There is a proposal to make car loan interest and purchase of home generators a tax deduction. So you all are going to run out and buy a home generator and get the higher priced car, right? Because we may have these deductions. But I thought that was interesting. We don't know if it would be itemized or we call above the line before your itemized deductions or not. But that is a proposal. It's interesting.
I'm going to lobby for the car one.
I think it'd be great.
My car's pushing 20 years old. It's time to replace the jalopy, but I'm going to hold out and see what comes.
Yeah, really good timing. Okay, child tax credit. So this one we almost have to take with a grain of salt. We don't know. Vice President Vance did say that he would advocate a $5,000 child tax credit, increasing the current $2,000 child tax credit. We were left a little uncertain if that was an olive branch to try to get some bipartisan discussions going. It tends to be a very important aspect for the Democratic Party to see that happen. We don't know what will happen there exactly, but that was floated around. And last but not least is the estate tax that we talked about. Plain and simple, the proposal is to extend the higher estate and gift exemption as it is right now. So in some ways, a lot of these proposals are fairly simple. There are some very curious and interesting ones, but these are the main provisions that we wanted to talk about.
So now's when the crystal ball comes out. Like, okay, what is the path to legislation, given, where we're at with respect to, Congress and the presidency and who holds it? So this is just an overview of what is the current breakdown of Congress. And as you can see, there's slim majorities. So the Republicans have 218 in the House, whereas Democrats have 212. So again, slim majority, 53 to 47 in the Senate, which means there's going to be a lot of tension, right, in trying to get legislation passed, because the Republicans can't lose very many folks. And going back to what Steve was saying, there's a pretty wide contingent and difference in the Republican Party, in both, well, mostly in the House, but also in the Senate, and kind of what their various concerns are, what their various agendas are. So how do you keep them all as one voting block? Because if they lose anybody, then they have to reach across the aisle to try and get some Democratic support, which could be challenging given the current environment, if you will, in Congress. And if we think back to when tax legislation happened back in 2017, the margins here are slimmer than in that Congress. In the House back in 2017, there were 240 Republicans to 194, I think, Democrats. So there was a much larger margin for losing folks and not keeping everyone voting as one. And when we think about, like, how does something become a law, it starts in the House. Traditionally, if I go back to Schoolhouse Rocky, right, I'm just a bill. So it starts in the House, everybody fights about it, finally comes up with a bill, they bring it to the floor, vote on it. If it passes, then it moves to the Senate, they fight about it. If they like it, if they don't like it, it goes back to the House for the House to change it a little bit, then comes back to the Senate, Senate votes on it, passes. So again, if they lose anyone, it could be challenging for that process to play out. And there's some natural tension happening. One of which, and the first time I ever pulled up this slide, and I laughed because last week we had a tax training, and I was like, this guy stole our material. So the first time I ever pulled up the US debt clock, which if anybody wants to be nauseated, they can go out online and find this. It updates in real time, so you can see how large our debt is at any one
When you
time.
say real time, when I pulled it up, these numbers are flipping, like they're changing instantaneously. It's like you watch them go up, not by dollars, but by thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars per second. Those are the dollar amounts we're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, so when I first did this, it was when Obama had just won. And so I did a presentation on what we could expect years ago. And I think the national debt at that time was $9 trillion. It's at $36 trillion now, which is higher than our entire gross domestic product. Our gross domestic product is the $30 trillion number in green. Green we like, red not so much. We're spending $1 trillion a year in interest expense on our $36 trillion of debt. So when we think about what happens with interest rates, that changes that number. So that's $1 trillion going just to service the debt that we could use for investing elsewhere. So this is another tension, right, in trying to get legislation passed and get these tax cuts passed. The Congressional Budget Office released a report that said, hey, if we were just to extend the tax reform, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, without any changes to it, that's $4.6 trillion that we would add to our debt. And there are folks in both the Senate and the House that have indicated that that's kind of a non-starter for them. So then what is the path to potential tax reform? We're going to put option 1 in the parking lot for now, because that's likely the option that will happen. Option 2 is going back again to how does a bill normally become law, right? Starts in the House, goes to the Senate. Well, in the Senate, there's what they call the filibuster. So if they don't get 60 votes or more, someone can filibuster it, which basically kills it. And then it would have to go back to the House, and the House would have to revamp it and come back to the Senate. So there's talk about, hey, can we just end the filibuster so we can go to a simple majority instead of having to get 60 votes? Neither party has really shown a lot of interest in killing the filibuster when they've had control and the ability to do so, because the filibuster protects the minority party. And they're all worried about, well, someday I'll be the minority party, so I want that little tool in my toolbox. So it's unlikely that option 2 will be the path forward. So then we look to option 3. Okay, we're going to just negotiate and get all this Democratic support if we lose anybody on the Republican side. Again, I go back to the environment in Congress. It's unlikely that would happen with respect to a major tax reform proposal. So that's likely out as well. So then we go to option 1, which is budget reconciliation. This is how the Tax Reform Act of 2017 was passed. So what happens there is the House and the Senate decide on rules that they're going to play by in the reconciliation process. And one of the big rules in the 2017 tax reform discussion was this shall not cost us more than $1.5 trillion of additional debt. So whatever they came up with had to add less than $1.5 trillion to our debt as a nation over a 10-year period of time. So they'll come up with those rules. They'll work through this reconciliation process, and when it gets to the Senate, they only need 51 votes.
And
So
that's a good example. That's why we have the sunset provision.
mhm.
That was part of the reconciliation that was done then to cut off the savings or the
Right.
spending to then recoup it with the sunset.
That's right. That's right. To hit that 1.5 trillion budget number that they were
So
trying
if we're
to hit.
cutting off early and we don't recoup the 1 point, anyway, never
Don't
mind.
look backwards. Okay, Todd? We're talking about governmental spending, not your house.
Okay.
Yeah. If you go over budget at the house, then you talk about like, what are we spending? Right. So we'll see how this plays out. There's a lot of things that they're trying to get done. You know, Steve spoke to the big four. And so they're going to have to try and do a lot of that through some kind of legislation. There's been talk about putting it all in one big budget package and trying to pass all of it. So immigration, defense, energy, and tax all in one big bill and all in one big budget reconciliation package and try to get that done in the first year. Well, that's murkier, more challenging. It opens you up to more resistance, if you will. So likely, you know, there will be 2 budget reconciliation processes that have to take place, but who knows? That's hard to pull off in the first year. And really, they have this first year to get something big like this done, because it's scary to think, but you know, we just got through with a major election and they're already talking about midterms. And so what happens in midterm elections is the party that's in power usually loses control of either the House or the Senate.
Mhm.
So they're already thinking about that. Well, how do I make sure I maintain my seat, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a murky process. It's not going to be super straightforward. So we'll watch and see what happens. This is when that crystal ball would come in handy. And then there's tariffs. Well, how do we do tariffs? There's actually a lot of power that sits in the presidency around implementing and enforcing tariffs. Congress kind of delegated their power to the president, if you will, so he could come out with an executive action, which he did, and you know, Biden's done too. So it's like that is easier to do. However, tariffs don't necessarily go into that budget reconciliation discussion because of some arcane rules in the Congress.
So you're saying if we increase tariffs, that may not be part of the offset, the revenue that they're looking for to offset tax cuts.
That's right. Yeah,
Interesting.
interesting. So how do we plan for this, Todd?
Well, that's a great question, but I think we're short on time. Time to wrap up. No, just kidding. So this is the question of the hour. So we have so much uncertainty. We don't know what will be passed. We don't know if it'll be passed, and we don't know when it will be passed. Some may remember a few times we've gone through this, and we might be trying to plan, and we don't know the answer until January 1st of the following year, we should have planned for last year. Does anybody remember some times like that? So we hope that we get something done quicker, because 2025 is a very, very significant year. We've talked about sunsetting provisions. If they don't get something done, we know what will happen, and that's that everybody in this room will pay more tax. Also means that probably there'll be a big change in House and Senate, and a lot of things will change. You know, if we don't get something done, that will happen. But what can we do? Okay, all of us in the room. So I think the first thing that we want to talk about is, Josh, you'll be proud. Here we go. Plan to extend your tax returns. Why do I say that? With uncertainty, you can actually take advantage of the benefit of hindsight. If we don't know until late in the year if something will affect this year, that's a benefit. We have bonus depreciation this year set to be at 40%. There's a chance that legislation could happen that will make it back to 100%. Or if nothing's done this year, we want to think about it, the 2025 tax return, extending that, because by then, all of this will be coming into play. Bonus depreciation, sunsetting provisions, you have estate tax, all of these things. So extending a tax return can be helpful if these things impact you. The research and experimentation capitalization requirements could be huge for you to consider. If that impacts your business and the legislation is not final, you may seriously want to consider extending as long as you possibly can. Many did that this past year, hoping that bill would go through, but it didn't. Okay? The second big thing to do is to identify potential planning opportunities. Depending on what happens, this could be the year to really consider your entity choice. A 15% C Corp rate might be compelling enough to think about. It's an odd day in history to hear a tax accountant say, you might want to have double taxation to your benefit. But if you think about it, if you pay tax in the C Corp at 15% and you pay tax on the dividend rate of 15% personally, and you have an overall 30% tax rate, but if your individual ordinary rates are at 37, all of a sudden double tax is cheaper than one tax. That's odd. We're in odd times. We're in very odd times. Could that happen? It could. Will it happen? Crystal ball. We just don't know. Okay. You should consider deferring or accelerating deductions in income. And what do we mean by that? 2025, we know what the tax rates are. When we get toward the end of the year, if we have some answers, and if next year's, if say everything sunsets, you may, again, how many times do you hear your accountant say, oh, why don't you defer your expenses and accelerate your income? Happens once in a while, but not very often. But that could be the case, because I don't know about you, if I had to pay tax at 37%, I'd rather pay 37 than 39.6, right? Or if I knew that a larger portion of my income were going to be taxed at a lower rate in 2025 than next year, again, I might want to take advantage of 2025 tax rates. The SALT tax and the pass-through entity, again, there's something else to consider. If the SALT tax limit goes away, how's that going to affect your pass-through entity? They could legislate how that will affect your pass-through entity. They could legislate that and make it not available, or it could stay in play. So these are things that we really need to pay attention to. And so I guess one shameless plug is whoever your tax professional is, this would be a year to be in close contact. Don't wait until this time next year to have conversations, but have some conversations throughout the year. Have those conversations so that you're not caught unaware or your pocketbook is caught unaware. You know, cash flow ebbs and flows. And if tariffs come into play, all of these things are just rolling and rolling. It's kind of like being on the ocean in a storm right now. What would you say?
I agree. You know, it's better to know, like, if change is change is coming.
Change is coming.
Change is coming. So can we identify what are the levers I can pull either way? You know, if my tax rate goes up, what lever do I want to pull? If my tax rate goes down, what lever do I want to pull? So it's all about identifying what's available to you. And the sooner you do that, the better. And what better time than when you're getting ready to file your 2024 returns and all that stuff, you know. Start talking to your CPA now.
Yeah, you can take 2024 as a baseline and say, what if? What if everything's the same and this happens, or if that happens? If that's helpful information, those would be good discussions to have. Yeah, wonderful. All right, we're to that point where you get to decide how much more you endure or how much more you want to know. So questions. And the first one is...
Do I have to flip it? Okay.
Here we go. What is being forecasted for changes to the nonprofit sector? There have been articles written recently by reputable national leaders that the new president is not a big fan. Are you a nonprofit specialist? I am not. I am not a nonprofit specialist either. Hey, Bryce.
Yeah, you knew it was coming.
You started to squirm, didn't you? Have you heard anything? Or Margaret? Okay. Boy, first question,
I
and
know.
we failed.
What do you expect? I learned I'm a cow. So I'm from Oregon. So I guess this is what you get.
Maybe so.
Letting us in. Let you down.
Yeah, I have not heard a lot about nonprofits actually, so
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
don't
even going to
Todd.
try.
Todd, I would say, I think with everything else they kind of went over, I don't think we're expecting any significant changes in the nonprofit sector, at least 990s. And you have to
Nothing
remember that
significant.
that whole sector includes private foundations and a bunch of other tax pieces that are really important to wealthy individuals as well. So I really wouldn't expect them to focus on that. They're going to have their hands full with the Reconciliation Act and just trying to get stuff extended.
Most likely. Yep, absolutely. All right. Any other questions? No. We either did a great job or you're so entirely bored that you're like, I can't possibly endure anymore. Well, thank you. Hopefully that something helpful came out of it, and you'll have a great thought process as you gear up for 2025. And if nothing else, I think we'll all be a little more interested in the political process. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Thank you. Thanks, Renee. So we'll just wrap up. We'll wrap up here really quick, but just a couple of things before we conclude. One, I wanted to thank Todd and Renee and Steve again for speaking at our event this year. It's been great, so thank you very much. And then I'd also like to say those who need CPE, please sign out. You don't get CPE unless you sign out, so please remember to sign out if you need that. This year we had a giveaway for those who signed up early and registered. So the winner of that drawing is Kevin Richmond. So talk to Victoria afterwards. So, and speaking of Victoria, this entire event, Victoria took on a new role this year for Harris as our kind of event coordinator. Is that the right title? Okay, but she's done an absolutely wonderful job, and so I want a round of applause for Victoria. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for everyone here. We've done this for several years, and it's really beneficial and works because you guys come and attend, and we love seeing you guys in person and be able to interact as we get going. I think there's a lot of change coming down the pipe. I think, Todd, you guaranteed lower tax rates. Is that what I heard? No, I'm just joking. But there's a ton of change coming both in our economy and our tax rules, and then you have Idaho and everything that's coming on here locally. So we look forward to working with everyone in the room throughout the year. And thank you again for coming.